fellowship and come back feeling refreshed and ready to go. Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 9 is a wonderful passage. You could preach this year in and year out. You could preach this one passage for 10 years straight. This is such a wonderful book. The story of Moses and Joshua, great leaders that God used, and you go through there, so many things about their lives. So if I taught about Joshua for a whole year, we wouldn't exhaust all there is to teach about Joshua. Chapter 1 and verse 1. Now after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spake unto Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' minister, saying, if you were to ask the people of Israel today, who are your heroes, Israel would immediately mention Moses. And they would talk about Abraham, and they would talk about David. And Abraham, of course, is the father of Israel. He's the man that God chose to begin the line of Israel. Moses is the man that God used to lead the people out of Egypt. And then David was the great king of Israel. Saul was the first king, but he got away from the Lord. But David was the king that God chose. And then Elijah was a tremendous prophet and a great leader. But today, we learn that Moses has been leading Israel. How many years did he lead them? 40 years. And God has relied on the leadership of Moses for 40 years. And now Moses is 120 years old, and he's going to die. And it's not good riddance. A new man is coming. If you read the chapter before this, at 120 years old, Moses' eyes were not dim. He had not deteriorated in any way. He was as when he first took leadership of Israel. He was strong and ready, but it was God's time for him to go, and God took him home. And Israel had relied on Moses. There was no other man on earth like Moses. Moses was a very unique man chosen by God to lead Israel. And now Moses is gone off the scene. And Joshua is the new leader that they're going to rely on. Now Joshua has done well. If you look back into Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, you find that Joshua was already a servant of the Lord. Joshua was already busy for God. And then we see, as we come to verse 2, God says, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, this and all this people, unto the land which I do give them, even to the children of Israel. The same promise that God gave to Moses, he gave to Joshua. Well, it's not a lucky thing. God gave this promise to Moses, and he gave it to Joshua. It's the same promise that God gave to all of Israel. And today you might say, oh, Moses was a lucky guy. He had a great life. No, God made a promise to Moses. God made a promise to Joshua, and he gives us the same promise, not the land of Israel. That is the promise to Israel. But as Christians, God gives us exceeding great promises. You say, really, I have promises? You do. There are promises in God's Word that belong to you. You'll find them there. If your grandfather were to die and leave you $1 million in the bank and you didn't know it, how would you like that? If you found that, can you imagine finding out that in your will your grandfather had left you $1 million and then just setting that will aside and not doing a thing about it? No, absolutely not. You might, can you imagine getting to old age and living in a rundown house and not having a good vehicle and not having a way to pay for your children to go to college, but you never claimed that $1 million that was left to you in the will? Wouldn't you go and claim it and say, hey, that money belongs to me, and go and get it? That's mine. That's for me. I am the grandson of my grandfather. Wouldn't you want to use that money to make the things of your life go better? Well, God promised some things to Moses, and he promised them now to Joshua, and he passes on that same promise, and they're supposed to go in and take the land. And you have things that belong to you as well. God has promised you as a Christian some things in the book of Ephesians, in the book of Galatians. You can find precious promises that God made to his people, and we can claim those. And if you're unhappy in your life and you're frustrated and you're discouraged, you might be missing out on the love and the joy and the peace that God has promised you. They're available to you. They're there in his word for you. And you need to find out how to get those promises so that you can have victory in your life. Joshua becomes the new leader. Now, Joshua is not new at leadership. Joshua has been serving the Lord under Moses already. He's already proven himself faithful. And God uses him to be the next leader. Maybe today, you say, well, I want to lead something. I want to be responsible for something. Start now by doing small things. Do small things and let God use you and let him promote you. He will. But if you sit back and do nothing and say, well, I want a big position, I want something important, you're probably not going to get that position. You probably never will. You have to start with small things. That's what Joseph did. Remember how Joseph's brethren hated him and he kept serving God. They threw him into prison or threw him into slavery, and then he served God, and he went to Egypt, and he served God, and in the prison he served God, and later we find him as a leader in Egypt. This is what happened to Daniel. Daniel was taken to a new country. There he served God, and over 40 different kings died in the time, 4 different kings died in the time that he was in Babylon, and he was exalted. God exalted him. You want God to use you in a great way? You want to be a leader someday? Then right now, be faithful, be active, be consistent. Be what God wants you to be, and God will promote you and he will use you. Paul, at the end of his life, said, I have finished the fight. I have kept the faith. I've been obedient. But if we look back 30 years in Paul's life, Paul met Jesus on the road to Damascus, and Jesus said, why persecutest thou me? And he told him to go and serve him, and Paul did. And 30 years later, we find Paul being used greatly by God because he was faithful 30 years ago up until the time he died. John the disciple, Jesus met him and said, come follow me. John said, I will. He followed him. He followed him until he was 95 years old. And God said, I want you to write the book of Revelation. One of the most wonderful books of the Bible, tells us about our future. But John served God for 50 years before he wrote Revelation. He served him faithfully. He wrote the book of John, and then he wrote 1 John, and he wrote 2 John, and 3 John, and then he finally wrote Revelation. He wrote those 5 books. But John humbly served Jesus year after year and stayed after it. And he wrote 5 wonderful books of the Bible. You and I can be great. But we have to learn from the life of Moses and the life of Joshua that we have to be faithful. We have to be consistent. That's what Joshua had to do. That's what you and I have to do today. It's not about who's the smartest, who's the luckiest, not because he was, just because he was Jewish, not because of the degree he had. Those things aren't important. Paul was greatly educated. Peter didn't have any education. He was a fisherman. God used both of them. And you and I today, it doesn't matter what it is that you have. You may have a college degree. That's great. You may not. You may have quit high school. That's great. That's fine. God can use you, whoever you are, if you will just serve him consistently and be faithful. God will use you in a tremendous way. You can read through the whole book of Joshua and you will find that he had a fantastic life. Let's go and look at There you go. Is that better? Joshua chapter 23, verses 2 and 3 say, Joshua called for all Israel and for all their elders and for their heads and for their judges, for their officers, and said unto them, I am old and stricken in age, and ye have seen all that the Lord your God hath done unto all these nations because of you, for the Lord your God, he that hath fought for you. In chapter 1, Joshua is about 84 years old. This is now 26 years later. Joshua died when he was 110. Joshua is calling together the men to rehearse the victories that they have won because God fought for us. And Joshua is getting ready to pass this down to Israel. God will fight for you. God will be with you. You'll have wonderful victories in your life. In chapter 1, Moses died. Joshua takes over Israel and leads them until he dies. That's what we need to do. Serving God is the best decision you can make in your life. There are a lot of things in life you can get involved in. You can be involved in finance or helping fight for deaf rights, or there's a lot of things in life that you can give your attention to, but nothing is as great as serving God. You can serve Him in school, you can serve Him at work, you can serve Him with your family, you can serve Him in anything that you do. But apart from God, trying to figure out your life on your own, God will let you go that way if that's what you choose. But He's the God of the universe. It's better to have Him on your side. Don't go it alone. Better to have Him with you and to fight for you and to help you claim victory in all the promises that He's made to you. Joshua claimed the promise that God made to him. And when he died victorious. And he led Israel in a great way. What I do affects you. What you do affects other people. You say, well, just let everybody do their own thing. I just want to take care of me, that's all. And if I do that, then you'll do that. Then the people following you will do that. What we do affects the people around us. What I do affects somebody else. What you do affects somebody else. Be careful that your example is good so that you affect people in the right way. In the Old Testament, before this time, Joshua and Caleb and the 10 spies had gone to spy out the land, and 10 complained, and Joshua and Caleb said, let's go. Those 10 men lost the promise of the promised land, and they influenced the children behind them to do the same thing. But Joshua and Caleb influenced people to serve God. There were only 2 that had that good influence out of the 12. We can make that decision too. Am I going to influence people in the wrong way, or am I going to influence them for God? You say, well, I'm a nice person. I'm not involved in any awful sin. But if you don't have God as a part of your life, that is an awful sin. Or putting God below your priorities, putting God below your life's goals. That's idolatry. That's the worship of self. That's a sin against God. But apart from God, serving Him, putting Him first, you can be the same as Joshua was. He claimed the promise of God and received God's blessing. Say, I'm 20, I'm 30, I'm 50, I'm 70. It doesn't matter what stage of life you are in. Just decide today, I'm going to serve God. And at the end of your life, you'll have that victory. You'll be able to say, I have fought a good fight. I have the promise that God gave to me. That's what Moses did. Today, our society is different, they say. Joseph, Daniel, Moses, Joshua, all of them had problems they had to face. They weren't the same problems, but they needed God to overcome. It doesn't matter what the situation is. It doesn't matter if you're in jail, out of jail, in a different country, in your home country, wherever you are, You just need to decide, I'm going to serve God, I'm going to claim His promise, and I'm going to have victory in my life and stay with it to the end. Let's stand.